Well, congratulations on the book, Sean. This is awesome. Your second book.
I know. I didn't think there would be a first, never mind a second. So,
interesting timing to come out with this right before election. Did you plan this specifically? You knew it was going to come out right here?
Yeah, we could have talked about, we kind of discussed when we wanted to come out, and the thinking back in the day was the closer to the election, there's going to be a lot more interest in the president, his policies, why he needs to continue, what we're up against on the left. And so, I think the sweet spot when you're trying to plan a book is what else is going to be out there, what other dates, what holidays are happening. And this is all being done well before COVID happened, so you're guessing a lot of cases. But we thought the closer to the election, the better.
One thing that's interesting is the very beginning of your book, and I was like, yes, I started laughing. You talk about how every election, people say, pundits or politicians, it's the most important election of your life. You got to get out there and vote. And we've heard that a lot this election cycle, but you say it really is. Why is that?
Because I've used the line before. I've been through several presidential elections. I think that never before have the two parties and the two candidates wanted to go in two separate, totally different positions, right? You've always had candidates that were center left, center right. It was kind of like you're going to get a difference, maybe in style or tone and policies, but this time it's truly a radical difference. I mean, you're talking about whether it's taxes, and Joe Biden wanted to get rid of the Trump tax cuts. So many of the other policies that we want to see. I mean, you look at the Green New Deal, some of the things, the judges that will appoint, all of those are radically different than what the president's talking about continuing to do. And I think the case in here is to lay out what we're up against. And I don't think, one of the things that I thought was interesting about writing the book is that when you look at big tech, academia, and that's K through 12 plus college, corporate America, all of these other institutions that exist, I don't think most people fully appreciate the lurch of the left, that there's this indoctrination in terms of what's happening, and I talk about in terms of Hollywood and what's going on in pop culture. It's that you don't see it suddenly, this term gets banned, this is the way you're supposed to say this and not say this person gets exiled, this commercial gets taken off the air, this company gets petitioned or boycotted. And slowly, when you look at the totality of it all, you realize that these policies and these issues from the left are creeping into our culture in a way that you don't necessarily think of if they're just looked at in isolation.
Yeah, and in your book, each chapter highlights one of those institutions that you mentioned, but you talk about how it's gotten even worse over the Trump administration. Why do you think that is, and is there a way to change that moving forward? Are we stuck in this trajectory now?
In each chapter, whether I'm talking about big tech or academia or Hollywood, I'll give you an example. In Hollywood, I talk about what's going on there and how sometimes they'll put their own business interest behind their principles. So you look at movies that do really well. We've had Jim Caviezel on, right? Yeah. So Passion of the Christ, you look at Soul Surfer. A lot of these movies that have done very well, that have sort of a good Christian or a family theme, they do very well. And you would say to yourself, why wouldn't you make more of those movies? They don't, because they're not part of the Hollywood values that they want to pass on. And so I talk about, for example, there's a movie called The Chosen. It's a crowd-funded movie series, documentary series, if you will, drama series about the life of Jesus Christ. These people raised $16 million by saying we want to do something that became hugely successful. Right? You look at shows like Mike Huckabee on TBN, Greg Gutfeld, that there is a desire for comedy and good programming on the right. They do really well, and you would say, well, then why aren't they getting picked up on an HBO or a major network? Well, it's because it cuts against the grain of their values. And I think that's the big thing, is that we're up against forces. One of the things that I mentioned is look at the late night shows. Yeah. They used to be about jokes and entertaining and sort of unwinding at the end of the day and laughing. And who was on, the other night I turned on, it's Cal Cunningham, the guy who's running against Lyndsay Graham. It's become a political show. And nothing, there's never a Republican on a late night show. It's always now about politics, it's always anti-Trump, and it's always about trying to find candidates and causes to support. What happened to just being funny? Now, obviously, everyone has a right to do it, but if you don't stop and think about it, if you don't stop and say, wait a second, I never even thought about that. And part of what I want to do in the book is to lay it out and to say, have you ever noticed you don't see a conservative ever on late night shows? I mean, except when they're being mocked.
Yeah.
And then what I do is I go in and I talk about in each area, things that are happening during the Trump era to combat those. So in the Hollywood chapter, talk about like The Chosen and other projects that are being funded or that are going to market in different new ways, whether it's YouTube or crowdsourcing and happening like that. Or in the education chapter, some of the stuff that's happening in kids' classrooms today is astonishing. The values they're teaching and what they're saying is right and wrong. It's not about reading, writing, and arithmetic. But then there are organizations like Charlie Kirk and Turning Point that are out there bringing conservative values to high schools. And I mentioned the fact, for most kids, they don't know the difference. And you find out that when these kids start to learn stuff, they get shouted down or whatever, cancel culture hits them. And so understanding what's going on and then some of the positive things that are happening to counter them is important.
You have a whole chapter on journalism, and one of the interesting things that you talked about was how journalists or kids who go to journalism school are now taught how to report on not the world as it is, but how they think it should be.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting. We see that playing out now in how the media reports the news. And what do you see things that are counteracting that now, or are we on a path of just people reporting what they want?
There's definitely a shift, right? You're going to journalism school, and instead of like learning how to report the facts and report the news, they're talking about how to change things, right? And that's stated in the mission statement of several of these journalism schools. How to change the world, to bring about change. That's a vast difference from a decade or a generation ago when we were talking about news being reporting what happened, just the facts. Now it's a very different thing, and you wonder why you see this activist journalists going on. And again, in that chapter, I go through the courses that get taught, the teachers that exist, the mission statements at these top journalism schools. And you start to realize, you wonder why you get a journalist doing and saying things they do now when you stop and realize, okay, this is what they're being taught. So no wonder we're getting what we're getting on the other end. It's because, you get garbage in, you're going to get garbage out.
Yeah, go back to the root. That's really interesting. Talking about college, because you've actually spent time on college campuses, Berkeley, Northeastern. You've had some interesting experiences. When you show up at these places, do you feel like people are eager to learn and understand a different perspective, or are they just ready to attack?
It's a great question, Lyndsay, because in many cases, there's a huge desire to engage in a civil and interesting conversation and to learn. Because in many cases, and I point this out, how many college campuses have either had zero or very few conservatives ever on campus? This is where they're supposed to learn, to discern the differences between ideologies. And yet they get shown one way, and when the other one comes in the times that it do, they cancel them out, they protest them, they riot them. And so I think that there is a huge learning curve, or a huge desire rather, in organizations like the Leadership Institute, the Young America's Foundation are funding conservatives to go. And I point out why that's important, because these kids are graduating college without ever having an alternative viewpoint. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but they're not exposed to it. And when I remember, I talk about this in the book, I went to Berkeley, and I kind of came out on stage right away, and I'll be honest, I was a little nervous. I always joke that I could tell how bad the campus was by the number of armed security officers that were with me. And they had people light things on fire and started riots. I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting. But when I walked out on stage, I said, look, can I just make a deal with you all right now? I will stay here all night. Remember, we're 3 hours back on the East Coast, so I had a little energy. No, I was like, hey, I got this. It's 10 o'clock there, and it's 7 o'clock in my mind. And I said, I'll make a deal. If you guys are respectful and civil, and I'll answer any question you have, and I'll stay here till the last question is answered. But the deal is that you gotta treat everyone with respect, and we gotta get through these questions. I got a standing ovation. It was, and the best part is it was reported on the Berkeley paper, so it's even they admitted it. But the point is that there's a desire to do this. Every time I go on a campus, whether it's Penn or Northeastern Illinois University, there's a huge, overwhelming interest. Doesn't mean they like you. It just means that there's an interest in understanding another's point of view. And yet, for a lot of these kids, it becomes this idea of going and figuring out how to cancel you out. Or I talk about this thing called the heckler's veto, and just trying to figure out how do you stop somebody from actually making a point. that's wrong, and it's sad. And yet the interesting thing is, it's not just the students. It's a lot of time perpetuated by the staff and the faculty at these universities and colleges.
So I'm going to ask you, why is that not like translating? We see so much cancel culture right now where people come out of universities, they get these jobs at some of these big tech companies or, leading different scenarios, and it seems like they don't want to have the conversation. It's not translating.
They don't, because it's my way or the highway. Again, there's a difference between preaching tolerance and inclusivity and actually practicing it. And what's happening is, if you don't believe in this progressive ideology, then you get shouted down, canceled out, or ostracized. Mm-hmm. And again, part of what the book is about is letting people understand what people are up against. And I actually think it's not just for people on the right, because to stop and to realize, to think, wow, I didn't realize the totality of that, whether you're on the left or independent, I think is eye-opening. But also, what are the ways in which you can kind of counteract this?
You have a whole chapter on Dancing with the Stars.
Yep.
This time last year, you were in the middle of that.
Yeah, we were pretty much getting ready for the quarter.
Yeah.
It was. I didn't get off till November. So yeah.
What was a highlight of that for you? It really seemed to be a good experience, and you speak about it very favorably.
I had the time of my life. I was so nervous doing that, I'll tell you. And that whole chapter really allowed me to relive it and give people an idea of what it was like to do it, to be in Hollywood, to go through the experiences that I did. But I think for me, I really was able to make this much more about me and about my family and some friends, and make it a bigger experience for me, and that's what made it so great. And I got to tell you, I talk about this in the book, but the people, they tell you when you start, and of course everyone makes you promises, they say, it's a family experience, and it's a Dancing with the Stars family. It truly is. From the people who, do the makeup and run the food services, to do the security, to the producers and the pros and the other, it becomes a family real quick. And I love the experience.
It's interesting because so often we see how Hollywood is kind of anti-right. We talked about this earlier with Jim Caviezel. He got blacklisted, all this stuff. But they seem to enjoy their experience with you, and you the same.
They do until they get called out on it, right? And then it becomes like, oh my God, I saw who. I think that there's a lot of people that initially want to be nice to you. They want to have a conversation. They're human. It makes sense. I don't like. I mean, I talk about this in the book. That I say the only people that I don't like are people who are mean to other people who have done something to deserve it. But I generally like people, and the problem is what happened for a lot of these folks who would come up and say, hi, I want to talk to you, I want to be your friend, they get called, how can you possibly do that? And that's the problem with the left, is they don't really want to engage in that civil conversation. They want to shout down anyone who wants to bridge that divide. We saw that a lot with whether it's the conversations that I had with Karamo Brown, who was there, or others, where people were just getting upset merely by the act of us having a conversation.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But it's great. For the first time, I really write about the entire experience in the book and talk about the people and the experiences and what it was like. I mean, the ups and the downs and some of the real challenging moments.
Last question for you. Why should someone read your book right now? You say it's not just for the right, it is also for the left. Do you want people to take an action out of this, or is it really for knowledge and to understand where we're at? I think people have such busy lives. And as I said earlier, I think that there are so many individual instances that in and of themselves, you don't realize where we're going as a society. But when you take them collectively and look at tech, corporate America, Hollywood, education, academia, as a whole, government, and you realize all of the forces moving in one direction and what people are up against, and stop and think, no matter, even if you're on the left, I think you can honestly say, in journalism, we talked about that, and say, I never thought about it in that way, so collectively. It will change your mind as to how you understand what's going on in society today. Well, congratulations. Super excited for you. Appreciate it. I'm excited. A lot of amazing points that you make in here.